Thanks for having me by to talk to you about this. Um, I think the quick way to know about me is I'm trying to work on better public technology, and I do advocacy to think about how we can use data and technology, more for the public interest and more so in a way that is designed and done, by the people, in terms of a democratic approach to technology. And I guess the only other thing that's relevant to this conversation to know is I used to work in the tech sector. So I've worked in various roles doing tech support, ended up doing product management. And then I also spent some time running community meetings on behalf of mostly city governments, but other orders as well. So I was a facilitator. I used to be at the front of the room saying, I have no vested interest in the outcome of tonight's meeting, and taking advice from communities and handing it to governments. And then that sort of ran me into seeing governments using technology more, and that sparked my interest in advocacy in that space. So that's kind of my little triangle of history relevant to this stuff. That's me.
Great, thank you. And I took your bio, which is very helpfully easy to find on your website, and they have more information on you should they wish to go find it. So yeah, it'd be great actually just to hear a bit, first of all, like you use the term public interest tech or tech in the public interest. Can you just say a little bit more like what you mean by that?
Yeah, for sure. I think democracy is one of those words that people hear it and think of different things. But for me, what that means and why it relates to public interest technology is that as governments use more technology, it's important that how that technology works serves people in a way that governments can be held accountable. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that governments have to build all the technology or that it all has to be open source. But it certainly means that if we're inserting a layer between ourselves and our elected representatives and the people that we need to seek accountability for, we need to have some role in making sure that technology serves our interests and that our rights are supported through it. And I think right now there's a lot of blurriness happening, and we need to intervene in some of those spaces. And that's when I think about technology for the public interest. I really think about accountability and utility for people. And I think the other thing that's relevant to that is that technology is not inherently capitalist. Like software does not have to be commercial. And I think if you look into the history of technology, this point gets, I don't think we talk about this enough, because technology and computer science has always really been in that commercial product, even through universities and research and all of it, very much a productized space. And I would love for us to grow our understanding of how we might use technology in a non-commercial capacity. And I think the word that a lot of us think about, for at least for me, and I think other people in our community, is as infrastructure. And how do we build more of it so we all can share in it and use it in ways that we want to? And those ways do not have to have a commercial element. It's not to say that it's supposed to be one or the other. It's just to say, I think there's room to grow that sort of non-commercial space. And some of that also relates to public technology to me.
That's great, thank you. And actually, even the word infrastructure, this wasn't in the original plans of questions, but infrastructure is just another thing that we will cover, and that I'm also just thinking a lot at the minute. So I'd love, what do you mean by infrastructure? Like, what are all the things that you think infrastructure can encompass? Because that can also be seen quite narrowly.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's nothing, infrastructure is another good one to think about, that the way that infrastructure is used is not always with equity. Like if you think about, say, I think some people like to use a railroad analogy, that, you build a railroad and then it serves lots of different people, but you also have to think about what it means to the towns that the railroads now go through and how they're impacted and affected. And so when I think about infrastructure, I think about it in terms of technology as how do we have something that I think equity in terms of its utility is really important. Civil rights, and I haven't gone enough down this like idea from a research perspective, so this is a thinking out loud one, but access to, the kinds of service, whether it's water, public school system, highway, whatever, sidewalks, like whatever these things are supposed to be, that they're supposed to be for everybody. I think is one of the ways to think about digital infrastructures. And that's not just access. And I think people who are quite learned on the digital divide topic, it's not enough that everybody has access to technology. It's, do they have the means to thrive and use it in ways that they want to? And that second level of work is much different than everybody having, cheap Wi-Fi or cheap broadband or, whatever the goal may be. And I think the last point here, and it's really not to say everybody needs to learn how to code or anything. I think we've lived through that. That's not it. But I learned something from the Mozilla Foundation. I can't remember who it was, but they talked about internet access being a very high percentage of it on mobile devices. And they likened it to literacy in a way that literacy is, for me, when I think of literacy, I always think about reading. I don't think about writing, but it's both. And on a mobile phone, if you get your access on a mobile phone, okay, like you might be ingesting, the internet, but are you outputting? Are you creating? Are you designing? Are you building? You don't often code on a mobile device. So I think that idea of literacy is like the two-way street, is helpful when we think about infrastructures, and not only what do they allow you access to, but what do they allow you access to, like, put back out into the world. So I think those are some of the features when I think about infrastructure. But I think it's very important to be careful with that point that infrastructure is inherently neutral or positive, because I do think there have been infrastructures that have destroyed, people's livelihoods because of the commercial relationship to what that infrastructure enabled. So I think we have to think about it a bit more critically, maybe, than what I've heard in the last maybe 10 years of rhetoric around data as infrastructure.
Thank you. So in what you were first saying, you use the word role, like the roles that are needed or the roles we can play, and I guess particularly, the fellowship and some of your work is related to this idea of, like, what is the role of communities and sort of civil society, but particularly communities, in shaping the impacts of technology or the dynamics of technology on our life. So I'd love to hear a bit about your thoughts on that. Like, what do you think the roles are?
Yeah, sure thing. I think it's important to differentiate between people who have funded capacity and people who don't, just as a starting point, because I think a lot of civil society, because it is funded, there's a higher onus to engage across different communities. And so what I think about is, when people are fighting for housing, when they're fighting for water access, when they're fighting for, there's a lot of causes that pre-existing, and I would say in terms of order, we need to figure out in our digital civil society how we come in and support and grow our relationships in those spaces, so that people who already have an established campaign going or something else can add in a digital piece, right? Like in terms of like housing access, I think about the fact that people are now building residential affordable housing with surveillance technologies in ways that you would never be able to get out of them, like at the unit level or at the entryway. And so there's a need to find more like intersectional advocacy there. But that requires, and the reason I talk about funded capacity, time, relationships move at the speed of trust. I don't know if you've heard that saying, but you can't just roll up and be like, hey, I know you've got a lot of work going on, but believe me, this is the important thing. And I think sometimes the digital community has a bit of that tone, and I'm not saying I haven't, but figuring out how to be smaller and put yourself into a complementary, supplementary role with pre-existing communities. And also being aware that some people might not want you to join their thing, and that's fine too. So that's one piece of it. I think another piece that came out a lot from the sidewalk, like from the Toronto work that I was involved in, is if like never to minimize the power of writing and words and unfunded or like lightly funded, that just helping people tell the story and helping other people who may be funded or whatever else, like add a demand to a campaign or write an article and say, here's the top 3 things that we're thinking about, and to share it. I think we need to really understand how much of our futures are really built by narratives. And I was glad you were talking about narratives, rhetoric, language, and reclaiming some of the words that communities, need to own and need to redefine in some ways. So I think in unfunded, if you're unfunded, don't minimize the impact you can have by helping people like understand a problem or write down some questions that need to be asked. So I think those are a couple of pieces. I think the last thing I'll say is think tanks. I know that that was something to touch on. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the funded civil society organizations, whether it's, nonprofit sector, charitable, or say a think tank, there's a conservatism inherent in the work being done in those spaces. And I don't want to, I think there's definitely a lack of lived experience in some of the spaces that, like a think tank or an academic, or, like there's a theoretical, but lived experience is also not the end of the responsibility or the way that work needs to get done. And I think I'm highly concerned that we're in a moment in time where like diversity and inclusion threatens to almost like shut down the complementary work of like, no, you're in this power position, you have power and you have to work at structural issues, and you're a white woman and you're working in this area. You don't get to say, oh, okay, we're going to hand this job to someone with lived experience, because that's it's got to be all the things. And so I think I'm concerned about some of the civil society piece and the think tank piece, because some of the harms of community, like, of how technologies have been used on communities aren't visceral enough, nor are the ways that they sort of bring some people into work on those things respectful or helpful, So I think that civil society needs to really look hard in the mirror right now, because I think there's a degree of conservatism that's too high. And if you're not willing, you can't just come in on an issue like human rights and just look at the privacy piece of it, when you need to have a much broader understanding of the picture and see like who should you be lining up with to support them beyond the like narrow scope of how this like digital layer is landing. I know that's a little bit abstract, but I just wanted to touch on that as well, because there's a lot there that I think we can all be doing better. And I fear that we're going to get stuck on avoiding the structural power dynamics that really need to be addressed, because they're hard. Like they're hard. That's why they're still there, but we all have a role to play. So.
Oh, there's so much in what you just said that I want to pick up on, but we haven't time today. Because I think the lived experience thing is particularly interesting and relevant in some of the work I'm doing with my other hat on as a funder as well. And yeah, and I worry in the UK, a lot of the funders in this space tend to be informed by the people that have come from a human rights perspective. So like looking at where tech and society meet, but through a rights perspective, that's not wrong or bad, but it is actually quite narrow.
Yep.
And yeah, so that's probably like a whole other conversation, but I really appreciate you sort of pulling that out. To pick up on one thing you said in that, before, I'd love to just hear a little bit about, like a very sort of practical and successful effort that you were leading around sort of collective action. Is like when you said at the beginning, you talked about how people in the sort of tech and digital world need to like make themselves smaller and connect into existing work that's being done around really important justice issues or community issues. Have you seen anywhere that has been done well? Because on the one hand, you sort of said, and I've definitely been guilty of this. You're like, but you should care about this. Why are you not thinking about the impacts of tech on this issue area that you care so much about? Can you not see, or do you not get like why this is a thing? And it feels wrong and it doesn't work either. So I'm just really interested in, have you any advice, or have you seen where that has been done well?
So I think not to sound grim about it, but not particularly. And I think it's important to place ourselves in a moment of time to identify a couple of structural things that I think I love the saying a diversity of tactics. Like I think there's lots of different ways to go at things. So I have two frames I'd like to lay out in case they're helpful. One of them is that the technology we're seeing in the world right now, I think, falls into two buckets broadly, and I'm sure that there's dregs that don't fall into either. But the one of them that's really hard to manage is, and it was very present in the Sidewalk Toronto case, is technology as economic development. Because what you have there is a government and a corporate sector that are equally vested in pushing technology. So no one is, when we go back to this idea of democracy, both sides are captured. So that really is difficult, because that's different than the one that I'd say is the older one, which is circa 1980 forward, which is just the general efficiency piece. So you get some technologies that are just like, well, this is just cheaper. And I think looking at which type of threat you're dealing with, and I would consider both of them significant threats to some of our public and our future, is important. So I think like that's one thing to just hang there. And then the second thing I'd hang up beside that is that in terms of tactics, I don't know about you and everyone in this fellowship area, but there's this sort of Julia Powell is a colleague. I love this term she used. It was admiring the problem. Is that, and I'm a big fan of thinking about two truths at once, right? And I think what we have to do tactically better is both be defensive and mitigating some of these harms that are just coming at us like constantly. And I think from a techlash perspective, there is a slow burn increase in the general understanding of like the problems with centralized power and automation and algorithms and many things. But also, let's not forget, I can show you very, very violent action done by the Canadian government this has nothing to do with the NHS, in Excel. Like you don't need to automate things, and you can use technology in lots of bad ways, right? But the point here is that there's a mitigation set of things we need to think about, which is the critique and the defining and admiring the problem. Very important. But how do we also hold and build out the what do we do instead? And I think like this is the piece that where I see a lot of success, there are communities building beautiful alternative technology options. I don't think we, myself included, are doing a great translation job in taking those things and translating them into policy, because I don't feel confident about policy right now because of the economic development pressure and imperative. But we also need to be building out. It's like, how do you hold back the dam, but also put forward a digital infrastructure plan that is community informed, so that at the very least you can say, yes, we know what we don't like, and also this is what we want to see. And I think we need to be building more of those. And I see lots of places, this is where you can get into like V-Taiwan, and there's some cool like technology approaches. They're not, they're again, diversity of tactic, they're one piece. But how do we put forward the stuff we want instead, so that it becomes the government's choice to ignore it rather than us to wonder, do they just not know what to do? Because here I'll end on one of my favorites. There is so much more negligence than malice in the technology space, but at a point, negligence becomes malice. And I think you can't underestimate the how many people are in the public sector. And this is where I get really upset. There is so much latent power and intelligence in the public service. And if they were empowered to execute more on like what we want instead visions, I think we could already be in a very different future. So I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity, but that takes the political leadership to want to do it. It's not a priority in Canada. They don't want to spend money on that infrastructure, and it's easy to avoid it until, and now I will mention the NHS, until the spreadsheet breaks, which brings us back to the austerity stuff, right? So I know that was all over the place, but I think that jumble of like, which type of thing is it? Is it economic development? Is it just efficiency, austerity stuff? And then mitigation tactics versus build out tactics. And I think mitigation tactics, where I've seen success, local level. And this is why I'm really getting fixated again on the city. The bans on surveillance technologies in the United States are happening at the local level. Like this stuff always lands in the physical world in a way. And so from an urban technology perspective, the cities are very much the like spaces of hope for me. I find the other kind of areas difficult because they don't land with a physicality, like ed tech, education tech. It's hard to give it a corporality, if you will, like it's hard to say who's really holding that one and where. But yeah, I think those frames help. And then within them, there is success. I think local is a good place to look. And also, is it a success on mitigation or a success on what should we do instead? I'll end very specifically in Toronto. Big success to keep pointing back to the procurement and to say, you were not mandated to to outsource the governance of this neighborhood to a private actor. And that was what we said from the beginning, over and over and over again. And it was a success because they weren't mandated, the governments weren't. And it was a lot of asking questions. Like, you don't have to show up and know always what to do. From a mitigation perspective, sometimes you're just like, so what is your plan for this? And then you can see the eyes kind of go, we don't have a plan for this. So that's successful, I think, from a mitigation perspective. So I think those are some of the little like lights of flickers of hope and light.
Thank you. Those frameworks that's really helpful. We do have to finish, but I would really like to finish just on you've just mentioned the sidewalk thing, the sort of city thing, which, you know, I can send people some links of stuff so they can read more about it. But it was incredibly impressive. I expect it was incredibly exhausting. But, you know, you were involved, you were leading a sort of collective action effort that resulted in, you know, in something pretty profound and important not happening in the city. So I wondered if you know, I don't want to boil it down too much, but if there were like a few things you would say to this group, which is, you know, which does have an emphasis on like, what can we do together that we can't do alone, and that kind of, yeah, that kind of idea of collective action. Anything you would just like leave them with, of like what
Totally.
you learn, or what they should
Totally.
consider.
For sure. I've got a couple. One of them is to really understand how stupid technology makes a lot of people feel. And as a result, chills speech and creates silence. And so your job, and this goes back to what I was saying about doing a better job being a translator, one of all of our jobs is to make it so people feel confident when they assert something to an elected official or to somebody else, and they don't need to have answers. This is what I was mentioning. You don't need to come with the plan as to, hey, you know, smarty pants, well, what should we do instead? It's not that. It's our job is to make it so someone who does not feel confident talking about technology does, and can go and say, what is this? You don't have a right to do this. What is your plan for X? What is your plan for Y? Because then you can bring it into a collective, because people who are housing advocates or who are working on education feel confident. And it's so easy to minimize that. That psychology is huge. It's how we got here with a lot of these things. Politicians don't want to look like Luddites. They don't want to look like they don't understand something. They don't want to look anti-innovation. So just do not minimize how powerful that rhetoric has been, and how important it is that we have, and this has succeeded in Toronto. I've watched elected officials this year get up and say, this digital infrastructure doesn't have adequate planning, and pushing staff back on bad procurement. And it was just like, my heart was so warm because they felt confident doing that. And they were, you know, like, good. So that's one really, really big thing, is not to minimize how much we can help people bring this fight to a space where they're confident asserting things. And again, questions. You don't have to have the answers. You just have to ask the questions, because a lot of the answers aren't there. And we know this. That's really important. And then I just think the second thing is it goes back to the being small piece of knowing that you may need to go out into other places and realize, like, when I talk to teachers or when I talk to people in unions around their job potentially being automated, they're looking at me saying, we're trying to get our dental care sorted. Like, I can't prioritize your thing. Like, I just can't. And so how do we work in a complementary way that is so deeply acknowledged of all of the fights that have been fought before we were born and still haven't been won, so that we're not understood as like thinking that our thing is so important and so big, because it just shuts down. You know, there's people in Canada, and I'll end on this point from a democracy perspective. I try to fight for our democracy, knowing that most people, when they hear those words, are like, that thing is not working for me, so I don't even care. Automate it away. When did it serve me? But our fight, I think, is to explain that the reason, and sovereignty, this is very much in your area now too, The point of sovereignty is that you have a right to demand things from the government that has nothing to do with the economics of the choice. So if we want to retain our power, we cannot let that power get automated away. And this is being important to teach the government. If you automate yourself away, we're all done, and you're not allowed to do that. And so I think that threat to our democracy, to retain this meager power we have, it's a hard sell for some, but we need to get comfortable in those words to say, look, I know this isn't going to be the thing that, you know, tilts the world, but if we lose more of our power, we're going to have a much harder time on all of these other issues to like assert ourselves. And I think that is really the threat to democracy that we're facing now. I mean, the Facebook piece is one thing, but actually the government automating itself away and its accountability and power into spaces that it can't see how things work anymore because it's obscured and obfuscated in like code and private systems. That's super dangerous. That's like the capture of our governance. So getting more comfortable saying words like that and knowing that when people hear you fight, don't feel bad to know that they're like, ah, whatever, that's like a second order problem. Find the ways to tie, and I can send you, I just wrote a piece about this, to tie our fight to everyone else's fight. And in Canada, my fight is for people to understand we are settlers on unceded territories. And if I can't describe why tech matters to like treaties from 200 years ago, I need to do more work before I talk, right? So I think we need to get out there and make sure that when we talk, everybody can connect what we're working on to their fight. And that again, nicely boils back down to like, that can be unfunded work. So that was longer than I intended, but I hope that's the problem with these threads. They don't scale well. They're not efficient, but I think that's the work we have to do.
No, thank you. There's so much in what you've said. It's been really lovely to speak with you. I wish we had longer.
It was a pleasure.
Maybe there'll be a part 2.
I'm
just going to say thank you, and then I'll stop the recording. So thank you.
Thanks for having me back.
And I'll